When we think about the history of Spain, the traditional narrative paints this highly dramatic, almost cinematic picture. The story we're usually told is that in the year 711 AD, military forces sweep across the Strait of Gibraltar, and boom, within a mere few decades, the entire Iberian Peninsula is conquered, transformed, and brought under the sweeping banner of a fully formed Islamic empire. But, as we often find out, history is rarely that simple. Welcome to this comprehensive study where we're going to partially analyze an alternative historical reconstruction. Today, we are presenting a full summary of a fascinating analytical framework put together by Thomas Seens and Dr. Jay Smith, featured on the YouTube channel Events and History, in their release titled The Islamic History in Spain is Not What You Think, Part 2. By the way, a link to the original source is provided below for your reference. Their argument is essentially that Spain's transition to Islam was absolutely not a rapid, overnight military conquest. Instead, it was a remarkably slow, culturally blended evolution. So we're going to examine the historical puzzle pieces exactly as they appear in the source material, completely objectively. So let's kick things off with a massive guiding question. What if the Islamic conquest of Spain didn't happen overnight? Seriously, think about the huge implications this theory has for our understanding of world history. We're universally taught that a definitive military takeover, spanning just a few short decades, brought a completely solidified, finalized religion into the Iberian Peninsula, instantly overturning the culture. But this study invites us to explore a completely different paradigm. What if Al-Andalus, the region we now know as Islamic Spain, actually evolved through centuries of complex theological disputes, political maneuvering, and gradual religious shifts? The source material we're looking at today suggests that instead of a sudden 40-year conquest, we are actually looking at a gradual merging of local anti-Trinitarian Christian movements and foreign political alliances. And they argue this process took well over a century and a half to crystallize into what we would eventually recognize as Islam.
Here's the roadmap for our study today. First, challenging the standard narrative. Second, Umayyads and Christian sanctuaries. Third, the anti-Trinitarian movement. Fourth, the missing early Quran. Fifth, the 850 AD tipping point. And finally, a new historical timeline. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Challenging the standard narrative, a slow evolution versus rapid conquest. And just a quick reminder before we dive deep, we are strictly examining the sources theory here without endorsing any particular theological viewpoint. We're just presenting the evidence from the historical record exactly as it's laid out in the study. Okay. So the standard narrative paints a picture of a fast, sweeping military blitz, bringing a fully formed Islamic religion into Spain in a matter of decades. But in stark contrast, this alternative reconstruction argues for a much, much slower theological evolution. It suggests a period of more than 150 years characterized by shifting political alliances and the gradual transformation of existing anti-Trinitarian Christian movements. If this timeline is correct, the societal and religious fabric of Spain was not suddenly flipped on its head by an invading force overnight. Instead, it was a prolonged, messy process. It was about local European beliefs slowly aligning with new political powers arriving from the East. This fundamentally changes how we view the entire era. We're not looking at a sudden clash of completely alien civilizations, but rather a long, complex blending of theological ideas and political survival over multiple generations. Section 2. Umayyads and Christian sanctuaries, the journey from east to west. Now, the story actually begins far, far away from Spain, setting the stage for the Umayyad dynasty's incredible journey. The source points out a crucial, deeply mysterious decision made all the way back in 724 AD by the Umayyad Caliph al-Hisham. Instead of staying in the glorious established capital of Damascus, which, by the way, had been chosen earlier because it held a major Christian pilgrimage site, the head of John the Baptist, al-Hisham moved his capital east to a backwater location called Rasafa. Now, why on earth would a Muslim caliph do this? Well, because Rasafa, previously known as Sergiopolis, was a highly prominent Christian pilgrimage site holding the grave of Saint Sergius, an Arab Christian martyr. Al-Hisham completely rebuilt this city in a Persian architectural style, deliberately positioning himself as the political protector of this specific Christian sanctuary. It shows just how incredibly blurry the religious lines of the era really were. In that geographical and architectural shift in the east, it directly impacts Spain through al-Hisham's grandson, Abd al-Rahman I. According to the source, Abd al-Rahman I had a wildly unique upbringing for a future Islamic ruler. Get this, he actually grew up in a Christian monastery. It's a bizarre historical irony, but it heavily influences the timeline. When the Abbasids violently overthrew the Umayyads in the east,
Abd al-Rahman managed to narrowly escape his family's slaughter. He fled first to North Africa, finding refuge with his mother's Berber tribe, and eventually crossed the sea into Spain. At that exact time, Spain was literally tearing itself apart in a civil war among Arab factions. With just a small Berber force, Abd al-Rahman miraculously leveraged his Umayyad royal name, ended the civil war, and established himself as the Emir of Al-Andalus. But here is the kicker. He wasn't bringing Orthodox Islam with him. He was bringing his monastery upbringing.
So, when Abd al-Rahman I took power in Spain, he brought his specific cultural and architectural background right along with him. He imported the Persian architectural style of his grandfather's capital, Risafa, right into the heart of Al-Andalus, commissioning the building of the world-famous Mezquita of Cordoba. But here is where the historical record gets truly fascinating, and honestly, kind of mind-blowing. The Mezquita was originally constructed as a church, directly mirroring the religious structures of his home in Risafa. Furthermore, the original structure did not even face Mecca. Think about that for a second. The architectural footprint heavily supports the alternative timeline, strongly suggesting that these earliest Umayyad rulers in Spain were promoting a localized Christian-adjacent culture rooted in their Eastern past, rather than imposing an orthodox, fully formed version of Islam onto their newly acquired territory.
Section 3. The Anti-Trinitarian Movement. Theological Shifts in 8th Century Spain.
All right, to truly grasp the source's argument here, we need to clearly understand a pivotal theological concept, adoptionist Christology. This was a form of anti-Trinitarianism, which was a theological belief deemed deeply heretical by the mainstream Catholic Church. Adoptionism essentially asserted that Jesus was solely a human man, a highly revered prophet chosen by God, sure, but absolutely not the divine Son of God. The study argues that this specific anti-Trinitarian belief system was highly prevalent among the ruling class in Spain at the time. But why? Why did the Umayyads like adoptionism so much? Well, if you view Jesus strictly as a human prophet, that theological stance very, very closely mirrors the emerging Islamic view of Jesus, known as Isa. The early Umayyad rulers found a natural, easy common ground with these heretical Christians, heavily promoting this mindset because it perfectly aligned with their own evolving theology. The historical records from this era provide a staggering glimpse into the true nature of this conflict. Fast forward to the year 782 AD. A man named Elapandus was elevated to become the Archbishop of Toledo. Now, typically, this incredibly powerful role belonged to a traditional Catholic, but Elapandus was an outspoken anti-Trinitarian. He actively tried to unite the entire church under this adoptionist theology. While he ultimately failed to convert the mainstream Catholic clergy, and yeah, he was eventually condemned by the Pope, his sheer power as archbishop reveals something massive about the era. It proves that during the late 8th century in Spain, the primary, most intense religious conflict was actually an internal power struggle within Christianity itself. The dominant battle for the soul of the Iberian Peninsula was between Trinitarians and anti-Trinitarians. It was not a civilization-ending war against a newly arrived, completely foreign religion called Islam. Which brings us to Section 4, the missing early Quran, 9th century church records. Okay, the historical anomalies only grows stranger as we move forward in time. Picture this, it's the year 839 AD, and the ruler Abd al-Rahman II convokes a major Christian synod in Spain to deal with religious splintering. We actually still have the historical documents produced from this massive gathering of clergy. Astonishingly, the main issue passionately debated by these religious leaders wasn't the overarching presence of Islamic overlords. Nope. Instead, they were completely consumed by a debate over a tiny, obscure heretical sect known as the Cathians, a group so insignificant that historians today barely even know who they were. They were likely just some minor Gnostic splinter group. Think about the irony here. If a dominant, foreign Islamic empire had violently taken over the country and suppressed the native religion for over a century, that would have undeniably been the central, desperate topic of this synod. Yet, there is absolute silence on the matter. Islam is literally not mentioned once. And it gets even crazier just 1 year later. In 840 AD, Bishop Albar of Cordoba wrote a bitter, complaining letter to other clergy members regarding the local heretics in his area. He stated that the people of Cordoba firmly believed Jesus was only a man, which is a clear, direct reference to the massive adoptionist, anti-Trinitarian movement we were just talking about. But here is the critical, smoking gun detail of the study. Bishop Albar specifically complained that these people were justifying their heretical beliefs using the Gospel of Matthew. The source emphasizes the sheer gravity of this detail, I mean, if these people were practicing Muslims adhering to a fully formed Islam, they would absolutely have been citing the Quran to argue against Christ's divinity, right? The undeniable fact that they were strictly relying on the Gospel of Matthew strongly implies that the Quran was not yet present, or at the very least, it wasn't yet considered an authoritative scripture in Western Europe by the year 840 AD.
Section 5. The 850 AD tipping point, the arrival of Muhammad in Spanish records. After over a century of this slow, localized evolution, suddenly everything changes. According to the source's reconstruction, right around the year 850 AD, a Christian bishop named Eulogius traveled to the east and returned to Spain, bringing with him a written polemic against Muhammad. The study points out an incredible fact here. This moment marks the very first time the name of the Prophet of Islam is definitively attested in the historical records of Spain. Boom! Just like that, the arrival of this Eastern document sent an absolute shockwave through the culture. Immediately, Christian leaders like Eulogius and Albar began writing scathing condemnations, naming Muhammad as the Antichrist. This single polemic from the East forced a peaceful, evolving society into a sudden, draconian religious split. In response to this sudden influx of Eastern Islamic theology and the pushback from the church, Abdul Rahman II began aggressively pushing this newly defined religion. The environment rapidly turned incredibly hostile, triggering the ruthless, systemic persecution and martyrdom of traditional Trinitarian Christians. The long, slow evolution had violently tipped over into a distinct, completely separate religion.
Section 6. A new historical timeline, converging with the standard narrative.
So, synthesizing this entire study, we can finally piece together a timeline that spans over a century and a half, telling a cohesive, albeit messy, story of human history. It begins back in 724 AD with the Umayyads establishing a Persian, Christian-adjacent capital in Rasafa. It moves to Spain, where by 782 AD, adoptionism is the primary theological dispute gripping Toledo. By 840 AD in Córdoba, heretics are still arguing their points using the Gospel of Matthew, showing an absolute lack of the Quran. And finally, we hit the violent 850 AD tipping point with Bishop Eulogius, where the religion suddenly gains a distinct adversarial identity in the West. This deeply matters because it shows history is rarely written in a single defining year. The study concludes that while the religion really began to solidify after 850 AD, a truly strict, draconian form of Sunni Islam wasn't completely imposed across Spain until the arrival of the Almoravid dynasty much later, all the way in the 12th century. Before we conclude our full summary today, the source material actually builds some incredible hype for a fascinating upcoming investigation. They plan to directly challenge the wildly popular Andalusian paradise narrative. You know the widely taught idea that Islamic Spain was this flawless, benevolent, and perfectly tolerant golden age where all religions lived together in complete utopian harmony. The creators of this study promise to examine the harsh historical records to counter figures like Adnan Rashid, exploring whether that utopian narrative truly holds up to the bloody evidence on the ground, or if there is another entirely different, perhaps much more turbulent paradigm waiting to be uncovered in the next phase of their research. Ending our study today with a provocative thought, we really have to ask ourselves if the origins of major historical movements are actually hidden in centuries of slow evolution rather than overnight conquests. What other inherited historical narratives might just be the tip of the iceberg? I challenge you to apply this critical lens to the other historical facts you were taught in school. History is rarely as simple as the cinematic, clear-cut stories we inherit. This study pushes us to look closely at architecture, at forgotten church records, and at slow theological shifts to piece together a much more complex puzzle. I highly encourage you to follow the evidence, check the link to the original events and history source below to explore their full presentation for yourself, and join us next time as we continue to break down fascinating historical investigations. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next study.